Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. I've worked at Riverside Memorial Cemetery for nearly 2 decades now, overseeing everything from maintaining the grounds to assisting grieving families. The job has its moments, but most days are routine. That is, until August 23, 2019. A date that still haunts me. The day started like any other. I arrived early, grabbed a coffee, and began my usual rounds. The summer was drawing to an end, and the weather had turned. Dark clouds loomed over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. A storm was brewing. I've always found storms oddly comforting, but that day, there was something different in the air. It felt heavy, like the sky itself was pressing down on us. By noon, Alan, one of my coworkers, called in sick, leaving me to handle the few appointments we had scheduled. I didn't mind. The cemetery was quiet that day, and I didn't expect much traffic. That is until Ethan Warren walked in. Ethan was about 35, tall, with a nervous energy about him. He had these deep-set eyes that gave off an impression of sleepless nights and long, burdensome thoughts. He was here to arrange a plot for his father, Mr. Samuel Warren, who, as Ethan explained, was in hospice care and didn't have much time left. I could tell Ethan was struggling to hold it together. He was the kind of man who felt emotions deeply but tried to suppress them with politeness and formality. We sat down in the office, and he showed me a photo of his father. Samuel looked like the kind of man you'd meet at a diner, quiet, unassuming, with a weathered face that had seen too much life. Ethan explained that his father had been ill for years, and now that the end was near, they wanted to prepare everything in advance. I nodded as I went over the paperwork, occasionally glancing at the picture of Samuel. There was a strange warmth in his eyes, something gentle that felt out of place with what would soon follow. The storm hit that afternoon, right as we finished finalizing the details for the burial plot. The rain came down in sheets, and thunder cracked so loud it shook the windows of my office. Ethan didn't seem to mind the storm. He even smiled at one point, saying his father loved weather like this. In some cultures, rain on the day of a funeral is a blessing, and maybe that's what Ethan was hoping for. Samuel passed away just 2 days later. Ethan called me to schedule the burial, his voice hollow and mechanical, like he had already gone through the motions too many times before. We set the service for the following Tuesday. I remember thinking how quick it all seemed. Death, in my line of work, has a way of compressing time like that. The day of the funeral arrived, and so did the storm. It was worse than before, the rain relentless, hammering against the earth as though it wanted to break through the surface. I stood under the small awning by my office, watching the procession as it arrived. The hearse, black and sleek, crawled down the gravel path toward the burial site. Ethan was in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. He didn't notice me when I waved. I followed the procession, making sure everything was in order. The cemetery was nearly empty, save for a few close family members, all huddled under black umbrellas. The wind whipped through the trees, and the rain made it hard to hear the priest's words as he gave the final blessing. There was a certain eeriness about the scene, just the small group, the relentless storm, and the rows upon rows of silent graves, watching. After the service, I walked back to the office, soaked to the bone despite my raincoat. I thought about Samuel, about Ethan, and about how lonely it all felt. I've seen hundreds of funerals, but this one left an odd taste in my mouth. I couldn't shake it, like there was something unfinished. By late afternoon, the storm had worsened. Most of the mourners had left, and I began my final rounds before closing the cemetery for the night. The rain had turned the dirt paths into mud, and the wind made the trees groan. As I drove my cart around the perimeter, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the rain, a figure moving between the gravestones. It was quick, a fleeting shadow that disappeared behind one of the larger monuments. I slowed down, squinting through the rain. The figure was gone, but my gut told me to check. I parked the cart and stepped out, walking cautiously between the rows of headstones. There was nothing. Just the wind and the rain. I was about to head back when I heard it, the distinct sound of a door slamming. It wasn't from the office. It was from somewhere deeper in the cemetery. I turned, scanning the area, but again, I saw nothing. Still, the sound echoed in my mind, unsettling me. I hurried back to the office, trying to shake off the weird feeling that had settled in my chest. Once inside, I locked the door behind me, hoping the storm would die down soon. But as I stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked grounds, something caught my attention. There, standing just a few feet away from the office, was a man. At first, I thought it was Ethan. The man was wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by the rain. But as he turned slightly, the light from the office illuminated his features, and my heart dropped. It wasn't Ethan. It was Samuel Warren. The same man whose face I'd seen in the photograph. The same man who had been buried just hours earlier. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of the storm, my mind playing games after a long day. But when I looked again, he was still there, staring at me through the rain, his expression blank and lifeless. There was no mistaking it, it was him. My chest tightened with panic. I fumbled for the door, flung it open, and ran outside into the storm, but by the time I reached the spot where I'd seen him, he was gone. Just like that. I stood there in the rain, soaked and shivering, my heart racing. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. There was no one there. Eventually, I made my way back to the office, drenched and trembling. I locked the door again, this time making sure it was secure, and sat down at my desk. My hands were shaking. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. How could I? Who would believe me? I chalked it up to exhaustion, the stress of the job getting to me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. And I knew that whatever it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep that night. No matter how much I tried to push the image of Samuel Warren's lifeless face out of my mind, it lingered, like a ghost hovering just at the edge of my thoughts. I told my wife that it had just been a long day at work, nothing more. She didn't press, but I could tell she noticed my unease. For the next few days I kept my head down, avoiding the cemetery grounds more than usual. Alan was back from his sick leave, and I let him handle most of the burial preparations while I stayed holed up in the office, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen had been nothing but a strange coincidence. A hallucination, maybe, brought on by the storm and exhaustion. But the feeling of being watched never left me. It wasn't until the following week that things got worse. It was a calm Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where the air felt still and suffocating, like the sky was holding its breath. I was at my desk, going over some paperwork when the phone rang. It was Ethan Warren. "Hi, this is Ethan, from last week. My father's funeral?" His voice was shaky, more than the polite nervousness I had encountered before. I don't know who else to call. Something strange has been happening." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I've been hearing things. Around the house. Footsteps, mostly, late at night. And I keep seeing him." I swallowed hard. "Seeing who?" "My father. In the house. He's standing in the hallway, just watching me." His breath hitched. "I know it sounds insane, but I'm telling you, it's him. He's there." I didn't know what to say. Ethan's words mirrored the terror I had felt just days before, but hearing it from him made it all the more real. "Ethan, maybe it's grief. Sometimes after losing someone, it's normal to see things. Your mind can." No, this is different," he interrupted, his voice rising. "I'm not just imagining it. He's there. Last night, I saw him standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move. It felt like he was angry." "Angry?" That single word made my skin crawl. "Did your father have any unresolved issues, maybe something he didn't take care of before he passed?" I asked, trying to sound calm even as my heart raced. Ethan hesitated. "Not that I know of. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly." But what?" There was something strange the night before he died. He grabbed my hand and whispered something. It was so faint, I could barely make it out. He said, "Don't let him take me." A heavy silence fell between us. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. What do you think he meant by that? I don't know. Ethan's voice trembled. But whatever it was, I don't think he was ready to go. And now I can't help but feel like he's still here, like he's stuck. The conversation left me unsettled. After we hung up, I stared out the window, my mind racing. What Ethan had described, I'd heard it before, not often, but enough times over the years. Some people claim that when the dead aren't at peace, they linger. They don't move on, trapped between this world and the next. I didn't want to believe that was what was happening, but the pieces were falling into place too perfectly. The storm, the apparition in the cemetery, and now Ethan's haunting experiences, it all seemed connected. That night, I stayed late at the cemetery, determined to figure out what was going on. I needed answers. I waited until Alan had left for the day and the grounds were empty. The wind had picked up again, and though the storm had passed, the sky was still dark, like a bruise that hadn't fully healed. I walked the grounds, flashlight in hand, searching for. I didn't know what. Something. Anything that might explain what I had seen. I made my way back to Samuel Warren's grave, the fresh dirt still soft under my boots. The headstone was simple, unadorned, save for his name and the dates of his life. But as I stood there, I felt that same oppressive weight I'd felt the day of the funeral, like the air was too thick to breathe. And then I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was the breeze playing tricks on me, but it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned toward the direction of the sound, my flashlight sweeping across the gravestones. At first, I saw nothing. Just shadows dancing in the dim light. But then, there he was. Samuel Warren. Standing just beyond the headstone, his face pale and expressionless, just like the night I'd seen him outside my office. His eyes, dark and empty, locked onto mine. But this time, there was something different. Something darker. His mouth moved, forming silent words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his eyes filled with an unspoken torment. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my office, the door slamming shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked the door, my hands shaking. For a moment, I thought about calling Ethan, telling him what I had seen, but what could I say? That his father's spirit was roaming the cemetery? That he wasn't at peace? I spent the rest of the night in the office, too afraid to leave. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. Samuel Warren wasn't gone. Not entirely. The next morning, I received another call from Ethan. "He's gone," Ethan said, his voice hoarse and relieved. "I don't know what happened, but last night, it stopped. The footsteps, the visions, everything. I feel like he's finally at peace." I wanted to feel relief, too, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not for me. Not yet. I left the cemetery that day, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. I never told anyone the full story, not Alan, not my wife. To this day, I don't know what I saw, or why Samuel Warren appeared to me. But one thing is certain. Somewhere out there, in the quiet of the cemetery, the dead don't always rest. And sometimes they come back. I've got this story that I've only told a few people, but every time I do, it sends a chill down my spine. It was one of those nights where you feel like something is bound to happen, even if you can't quite put your finger on what it is. It all went down a couple of years ago when I was still living in a small, rundown town in the Midwest. It wasn't much, just your typical, almost forgotten place where nothing really ever happens. Well, except for that night. It was October, the kind of cold that bites right through your jacket, and the wind seemed to whisper things you didn't want to hear. My buddy, Trent, and I had been close for years, bonded over our shared love for heavy metal music and our small garage band that we thought would take off someday. That night, though, we weren't thinking about our band. We were just restless. It was one of those nights where no matter how hard you try to settle down, sleep won't come. Around 2:30 a.m., we were in my car, parked outside his place, just aimlessly listening to music, hoping we could shake off the boredom. The streets were dead. No one in their right mind would be out at that hour, especially in our town. But for some reason, as the clock approached 3 a.m., we both had this unspoken idea that we needed to do something weird. "Let's go somewhere," Trent said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Anywhere." Now, in a town like ours, anywhere doesn't leave you with many options. Most places closed early, and there wasn't much nightlife to speak of. But we had one place in mind that we never had the guts to check out after dark: the old cemetery just outside the square, where the historic district met the overgrown woods. This wasn't your typical cemetery. It stretched out over nearly 40 acres, divided into an old and new section. The old part was hidden behind a rusted iron gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The newer part was where families still buried their loved ones, but the older section, well, that's where the real legends were. They said it was haunted. Every small town has stories, right? We didn't believe in any of that crap, but we thought it might be fun to walk around, take some photos, and laugh at the local ghost stories. We drove up to the cemetery, the headlights of my beat-up sedan cutting through the darkness. The wind had picked up, rattling the tree branches like bones tapping on windows. The entrance was marked by a stone arch that looked like it was ready to collapse at any moment. There were no streetlights, no lamps, just pitch-black shadows under a sickle-shaped moon. Trent hopped out of the car first, looking more excited than nervous, though I could tell there was something about the place that unnerved him. "You really want to do this?" I asked, pretending I wasn't just as creeped out. "Hell yeah," he grinned. "It's just a bunch of dead people. What's the worst that could happen?" The gate creaked open with little effort, though it made the kind of noise that set your teeth on edge. We stepped inside, and the air seemed to change. Colder, heavier, like stepping into a freezer. The older section of the graveyard had this eerie beauty to it. Tombstones leaning at odd angles, some half buried in the earth, covered in moss and overgrown ivy. You could barely make out the names and dates. Most of the graves were from the 1800s, pioneers, soldiers, and whole families who had died during some of the rougher periods in the town's history. The place reeked of history, the kind that clings to you and makes your skin crawl. We wandered around, snapping pictures, trying to outdo each other with ghost jokes and dumb impressions of horror movie characters. For a while, it was just us, the wind, and the occasional howl of a distant dog. But after about an hour, something changed. We made our way to the center of the cemetery, near this old, gnarled pecan tree that looked like it had been there since before the town itself. Trent sat down on one of the low stone benches nearby, and I leaned against the tree, staring up at the branches that twisted against the night sky like skeletal fingers. Then we heard it. A laugh. Not loud, not obvious, but soft, like the giggle of a child playing hide-and-seek. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Trent shot me a look, his face pale in the dim light. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Probably some toy left by a grave. One of those motion-activated things." He laughed nervously, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "Right, yeah, that's gotta be it." We sat there for a few more minutes, trying to convince ourselves it was nothing, but the air had gotten thicker, heavier, like it was pressing down on us. And then, for no reason at all, I felt it, a cold prickle running down my spine, like eyes watching me from somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision. I stood up, glancing around. Nothing. Just rows of graves, trees, and shadows. "What's up?" Trent asked. "I don't know, just feels like someone's out here." Trent chuckled, but it was forced. Dude, you're freaking yourself out? There's no one here but us and the dead. And that's when he saw it. There, he whispered, pointing toward a cluster of trees just beyond the far edge of the cemetery. I swear I just saw someone standing there. I squinted, trying to make out what he was talking about, but all I saw were shadows. You're imagining things. No, man, he insisted. I saw someone. Right there. Just watching us. We stood there for a moment, straining our ears, listening for any sound that wasn't the wind. And then it came again, the same soft, childlike laugh, but this time, it was closer. Much closer. I felt my stomach drop. Let's get out of here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Trent nodded, already moving toward the gate, his eyes darting around like he expected something to jump out at him. We didn't run, not at first, but we walked fast, our footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the cold stone path. Then, as we neared the gate, we heard it again. But this time, it wasn't just the laugh, it was the sound of footsteps. Light, almost like bare feet on the ground, shuffling through the fallen leaves. Following us. Without saying a word, we broke into a run, tearing down the hill toward the car, our breath coming in sharp gasps. I could hear Trent's footsteps pounding beside mine, but over that, I could still hear the laughter, the sound of it trailing us, getting closer. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them in my panic. The laughter had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed was almost worse. We jumped into the car, slamming the doors shut, and I gunned the engine. As we sped away from the cemetery, my heart still pounding in my chest, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing. Just the dark silhouette of the trees against the sky. We drove in silence for a few minutes, either of us wanting to admit how shaken we were. Dude, Trent finally said, his voice low. That wasn't just the wind, was it? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew that whatever had been out there wasn't just the wind. Something had followed us, and even though we'd left the cemetery behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. As we pulled up to the nearest gas station, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, the reality of what had just happened started to sink in. My hands were still trembling as I parked the car, and Trent sat in stunned silence beside me. Neither of us had spoken much after we left the cemetery, but the tension in the air between us was thick, like we both knew something wasn't right but couldn't bring ourselves to say it. I need to check the car, I muttered, more to myself than to Trent. He nodded absently, still staring straight ahead, his eyes wide like he was trying to make sense of what he had seen, or thought he had seen. The gas station was deserted. Not surprising at 3 a.m. in a town where the only thing still awake seemed to be the ghosts. I got out of the car, the chill of the night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The wind had died down, leaving an unsettling stillness that only seemed to amplify the sound of my own footsteps. As I made my way to the back of the car, something caught my eye. The rear door. It was slightly ajar. My stomach lurched. I knew for a fact that neither of us had opened it. We'd been too busy running, too busy freaking out about the laughter and the footsteps. My first thought was that maybe it had come loose while we were driving, that we'd hit a bump or something. But the car hadn't jerked like that. And even if it had, how could the door have opened on its own? I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before yanking the door fully open. The interior light flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the back seat. Empty. Of course, it was empty. But that didn't make me feel any better. I checked the seat, the floor, even the trunk. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the feeling, that creeping sensation like something was still watching us, hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now, like whatever had followed us from the cemetery had decided to hitch a ride. Everything all right? Trent's voice startled me, and I jumped, banging my head on the roof of the trunk. Yeah, I said, though my voice didn't sound convincing, even to me. It's fine. Nothing back here. Trent didn't say anything, just gave me a look that said he knew I was lying, or at least that I wasn't telling him the whole truth. We got back in the car, and I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. It wasn't like a locked door would keep out whatever had been out there, but it made me feel a little better. Like I had some semblance of control over the situation. I started the car again, pulling out of the gas station and heading toward Trent's place. We drove in silence, the radio off for once. I didn't want any distractions. I just wanted to get him home and put this whole night behind us. But as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. The empty space seemed to taunt me, like it was daring me to look away, to pretend like everything was normal. But I couldn't. Because it wasn't. Then, just as we were passing the outskirts of town, something happened that made my blood run cold. The laughter came again. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was right there, in the car with us. A child's giggle, high-pitched and soft, like she was sitting right behind me, whispering in my ear. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. "What the hell, man?" Trent shouted, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. The laughter stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the silence that followed was deafening. Trent was staring at me, wide-eyed and pale. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, his hand gripping the door handle like he was ready to jump out at any moment. "Yeah. I heard it." I looked in the rearview mirror again, expecting to see. I don't even know what. A ghost? A shadow? But there was nothing. Just the empty backseat taunting me again. "We need to get out of here," I muttered, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. "We need to get home." I floored it, speeding down the empty road, my heart racing in my chest. Trent was silent beside me, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror like he was afraid to look anywhere else. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. When we finally pulled up to Trent's place, the tension in the car was almost unbearable. He got out without saying a word, and I watched as he disappeared into his house, leaving me alone in the car with the suffocating silence. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at the rearview mirror, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I drove home, the sense of dread following me all the way to my doorstep. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the laughter again, echoing in my head like a broken record. And every time I woke up, I had the same feeling, that something was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. The next day, I called Trent. He sounded like he hadn't slept either. We talked about what had happened, but we both agreed that we couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe us? It was just a ghost story, right? Just something that happens in small towns like ours. But even now, years later, I can still hear that laugh. And every time I tell this story, I get the same feeling I had that night in the cemetery, that something is standing just behind me, waiting for me to turn around. And I never do. I'll never forget that summer, the one when me and Jake, my best friend since middle school, decided to visit that cemetery. You know, the one on the outskirts of town no one talks about. There's something about small towns in America. Every one of them has a story, some eerie place, a dark corner you're told to avoid. Ours was this cemetery. It wasn't particularly big, just a patch of land with maybe 100 graves, if that. But what made it stand out was how forgotten it felt. You could tell no one had visited in years. It was overgrown, surrounded by tall trees, and hidden by a rusting Gothic-style fence. Jake had always been the adventurous one between us. While I tended to stick to more reasonable things like camping or playing video games, Jake liked pushing the envelope. He was the one who found the cemetery on some old map online. "Dude, we have to check this out," he told me one hot summer day. I remember him showing me photos on his phone, grainy black and white images of crooked gravestones and a small, decaying house just past the fence. At first, I didn't want to go. I mean, who in their right mind would want to spend an evening wandering around a cemetery? But as usual, Jake's excitement got the better of me. "It'll be fun," he said. "And besides, it's not like we're doing anything else." So, on a sweltering Friday afternoon, we jumped into his old beat-up truck and headed across town. The drive was uneventful at first, just long stretches of road and the occasional passing car. But as we got closer, things began to feel off. The sky was a shade too gray for a summer day, and the wind picked up in strange, gusty bursts, like the air itself was warning us to turn back. I should have listened to that feeling. We pulled up just shy of the cemetery, parking a little way down the road so no one would notice us. The town might not care about the place, but we didn't want to take any chances. I remember the sound of gravel crunching under our boots as we headed through the woods that bordered the cemetery. There was no official entrance, just a gap in the old fence where the metal had bent and rusted away. The second we stepped inside, I felt it. This overwhelming sense of being watched, like there were eyes hidden in the cracks of the tombstones or behind the thick trees. Jake didn't seem to notice, though. He was too busy laughing and joking, pointing out the oldest gravestones and snapping photos on his phone. The graves were old, some dating back to the early 1800s, with inscriptions that had long since faded away. Most of the stones were cracked or tilted, a few even toppled over completely. A lot of the names were impossible to read anymore. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on dead leaves and dry grass. It was like we had stepped into some forgotten pocket of the world, where time had stopped and nature had taken over. My stomach tightened with every step, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want Jake to think I was chickening out. As we approached the far end of the cemetery, I noticed something strange about the small, decaying house Jake had mentioned. It wasn't just falling apart, it felt wrong. Like it shouldn't still be standing. The wood was blackened in places, like it had been burned, and the windows were all smashed out. But there was something more, a feeling, like the house was watching us just as much as the cemetery itself. That's when I saw him. I swear to God, for just a split second, there was someone in the window. A shadowy figure, tall and still, standing behind the broken glass. I stopped dead in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I nudged Jake and pointed, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "Dude, did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Jake just shrugged. "See what? It's probably just some reflection, man. Relax." But I couldn't shake it. My whole body was on edge, and the air felt heavy, like we were being smothered by something unseen. I wanted to leave, but Jake, being Jake, decided we had to check out the house. I tried to argue with him, but he was already walking toward it, determined to go inside. "Stay here if you're scared," he said with a grin, giving me a playful shove. And with that, he disappeared through the gaping front door. I stayed behind, pacing nervously among the gravestones, my eyes darting back and forth between the house and the trees. Every second felt like an eternity. I don't know what I was waiting for, maybe for Jake to come running out, laughing about how there was nothing to be scared of. But that never happened. Instead, something far worse did. Out of nowhere, I heard this voice. It wasn't Jake's, it was deeper, angrier. "Get out," it growled. "Get out of here!" I whipped around, my heart racing, and there he was. A man, probably in his 50s, with a thick mustache and wearing a long, black coat, like he had stepped out of some old-time movie. His eyes burned with fury, and his voice was like thunder. I backed away, too stunned to move properly. I wanted to scream for Jake, but before I could even make a sound, the man lunged toward me, shouting, "You shouldn't be here!" His voice echoed through the cemetery, loud enough to make my ears ring. My vision blurred, my legs gave out, and I hit the ground hard. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the man standing over me, his face contorted with rage. When I came to, everything was a blur. My head pounded, and my body felt weak, like I had been asleep for days. But I wasn't alone. Jake was there, dragging me through the trees, his face pale and panicked. He was yelling something, but my ears were still ringing too much to make out the words. All I knew was that we had to run. And run we did. We bolted through the woods, not daring to look back, our breaths ragged and desperate. The whole time, I felt like something, or someone, was right behind us, chasing us, pushing us to go faster. It wasn't until we reached Jake's truck, slammed the doors, and sped away that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But even as we drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. Something was still there, watching us, waiting for us to come back. And part of me knew that was just the beginning. I didn't say much on the ride home. Jake was unusually quiet, too, his usual grin gone, replaced by a furrowed brow as he stared straight ahead at the road. Every once in a while, he'd glance over at me, probably trying to figure out if I was okay. But how do you even start a conversation after something like that? We didn't talk about the man, the way he appeared out of nowhere, screaming at me, or the fact that I passed out right there in the middle of the cemetery. Instead, we sat in the thick, uncomfortable silence, both of us too shaken to really process what had happened. But then, as we were pulling into Jake's driveway, he finally broke the silence. "You were out cold, man," Jake said quietly, his eyes still on the steering wheel. "When I came out of that house, you were just on the ground. I thought..." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head. "I thought something really bad had happened." I didn't have the heart to tell him about the man, about how real he looked, how terrifying his voice was. Instead, I just muttered, "Yeah, I don't know what happened. One minute I was fine, the next, I don't know. It was like my body just shut down." Jake nodded, but I could tell he didn't buy it. And honestly, neither did I. We sat there for a few more seconds before Jake suddenly turned to me, his expression deadly serious. "Listen, there's something I need to tell you." I could hear the urgency in his voice, and it immediately made my stomach turn. I knew Jake too well. He wasn't the kind of guy to get freaked out easily, but right now, he looked downright terrified. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. "I went inside that house," Jake started, his voice low. "And I saw something, man. Something I can't explain." I waited for him to continue, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake was never one for dramatic pauses, so whatever he was about to tell me was serious. "I found this room," he said, finally looking at me. "It was like a living room, but it was all messed up. The floor was rotting, the furniture was covered in dust, but that's not the weird part. The weird part was what was in the middle of the floor." I leaned in, my pulse racing. "There was this symbol," Jake continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "A huge one, carved right into the floorboards. It looked like some kind of, I don't know, some kind of occult thing. And around it were these dolls. They were small, but they weren't like normal dolls. Their eyes were buttons, their mouths were sewn shut. It looked like something out of a nightmare." My breath caught in my throat. The symbol, the dolls, it all sounded like something from a horror movie, but Jake wasn't joking. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling as he spoke. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "That's when I heard the guy yelling," Jake said, shaking his head. "I ran out as fast as I could, and that's when I saw you lying there." I sat back in the seat, my mind reeling. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but none of them made any sense. Who was the man? What was that symbol? And why did I black out? Jake turned off the engine, and we both sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of everything. "I think we need to go back," he finally said, breaking the silence. I stared at him in disbelief. "Are you insane? Go back? After what just happened?" But Jake was determined. "I need to know what that place is," he insisted. "There's something wrong with that house, and I need to figure out what it is." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was crazy, but deep down, I knew he was right. As terrifying as it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was left unfinished, like we had only scratched the surface of whatever dark secret that cemetery held. So, against every instinct I had, I agreed. We'd go back, but this time, we'd be prepared. We'd bring flashlights, cameras, anything we could use to document what we found. If something was lurking in that house, we weren't going to be caught off guard again. The next few days passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, not work, not friends, not even my own family. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, heard his voice echoing in my head. Jake was just as on edge. He stopped joking around, stopped texting me memes like he normally did. It was like the weight of what we had seen was crushing both of us. Finally, the night came. We met at Jake's house around midnight, each of us carrying a backpack filled with supplies. Jake had even printed out some research he'd done on occult symbols, trying to figure out what the one in the house might mean. As soon as I saw the printouts, I knew we were in over our heads. We drove out to the cemetery, this time parking even farther away to avoid drawing any attention. The air was colder than I remembered, and the sky was an inky black, with only a sliver of the moon lighting our way. We trudged through the woods in silence, our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. When we reached the cemetery, that same heavy feeling hit me again, like we were being watched from all angles. I could barely breathe, but I forced myself to keep moving, following Jake through the broken fence and toward the house. It looked even worse than before. The rotting wood creaked in the wind, and the windows were just black, gaping holes. But this time, there was no sign of the man. The cemetery was dead silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. We hesitated at the front door, exchanging nervous glances before Jake finally pushed it open. The hinges groaned, and the smell of mildew and rot hit us like a wave. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the bow rising in my throat. We stepped inside. The house was just as Jake had described it, dusty, decayed, and utterly lifeless. Our flashlights illuminated the cracked walls and the broken furniture, casting long shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. But it was the floor that drew my attention. There, in the center of the room, was the symbol Jake had mentioned. It was a large, intricate design carved deep into the wooden floorboards, surrounded by those disturbing dolls. They were even worse in person. Tiny, human-like figures with button eyes and twisted limbs, their mouths sewn shut with black thread. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I stared at them, my heart racing in my chest. Something about this place felt wrong, dangerously wrong. That's when I noticed something moving. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, a shadow shifted. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a trick of the light, but then it moved again, slow, deliberate, like it was watching us. My throat tightened as I nudged Jake, pointing toward the shadow. His flashlight flicked over to it, and that's when we saw it. Standing there, half hidden in the darkness, was the man. The same man from the cemetery, the one who had screamed at me to leave. But this time, he wasn't yelling. He was just standing there, staring at us with cold, empty eyes. And then, without a word, he took a step forward. Jake grabbed my arm, and before I even knew what was happening, we were running. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, my mind racing as we sprinted out of the house and through the cemetery. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel him behind us, feel his presence, closing in with every step. We burst through the trees and into the truck, our hearts pounding in our chests, as Jake fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and we sped off into the night, leaving the cemetery and its dark secrets behind. But even as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. That the man, whatever he was still watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike again.